while we're talking about the other things, to ruminate, and then you can spring your ideas, having had 5 minutes of rumination on us. And the thought is whether, and it is a thought, it's not a proposal or anything like that, but it's a thought, is in the context of pre-action costs, and it's sort of in that sense, to some extent, arises out of Belzner a little. What if we passed a rule or something, or maybe it would have to be in a statute, I don't know, which made the beginning of the legal process, the court process, pushed it forward in time. In other words, for example, to the start of these portals. What if we did that? Something like that. Would that work? Would it have beneficial effects? Would it have unintended consequences? I mean, the thinking is just, as I said, it is a thought, is would that be a way of fixing some of the conceptual problems which people have identified in the context of pre-action costs, essentially by saying, well, they're not pre-action costs anymore, they're now action costs. I mean, that's a sort of simplistic way of looking at it, but that's the thing that we've been thinking about just as a possibility. But
may I just ask?
Yes.
Would that be for all matters or specific areas of activity? It seems to me, for example, for injury, it would be an excellent idea.
Okay.
But whether you have it right across the terrain is another matter.
Yeah. We're obviously open to discussion around that, and it may be that it wouldn't be appropriate across the whole terrain, but there may be some areas where it would. But there might also be unintended consequences of this, so we have to be aware of that.
Exactly. So that's so look. So there we go. Without further ado, let's go on to everyone's favourite subject, which is cost budgeting. You know, there's lots going on. We're thinking very deeply about it. I can tell you, I'm not giving anything away. I think I've said this before. Of course, we might think we should recommend that we should get rid of cost budgeting. That is within scope, let's say. But I don't think I'm giving anything away or shocking anybody to say that the feeling, at least so far, from everyone who's working on it, and I should also mention Amanda Master Stevens in the King's. Oh, it's still not quite there with the King's bench division. The Prince of Wales's bench division? No, that's not it. Is leading that particular subgroup, and I'm very grateful, Amanda, for the work that you do. Really am. But I think it's not giving anything away to say that we're probably not going to say that it should be abolished altogether. We might, but I just don't think that's going to be what it is. But we'll see. But that's not to say that there aren't significant things that need changing. I'm going to stop. I'm going to let Joe say something, and then I'm going to hear from you.
Well, I mean, much more difficult is the question of what tweaks we might want to make to the cost budgeting regime. And one of the issues that was raised in the consultation paper was whether cost budgeting should be default on for particular types of cases or default off. And if you were going to take that sort of approach, do you do it by reference to types of case, value of case? And again, I don't think it's giving anything away, and it won't surprise you to say that having looked at a very useful summary from Amanda of some of the responses that we've received on this, there is an enormous variety of views and an enormous amount of disagreement about whether cost budgeting should be default on below 500,000 or above 500,000 or off, or whether it should apply to high value cases or not. All sorts of different views. So this is very much, it seems to me, up for grabs. And I don't know whether any of you have any views about those sorts of issues.
Deathly silence.
If you say that it's going to be default off, then I suspect it will fall into disuse, because budgeting is not popular with many of the professionals, and it's not popular with many of my judicial brethren and sisters. And so if you were to blanket default off, I suspect that it would begin to fall away.
Well, obviously at the moment it's default off above 10 million.
I was going to say, of course, we've got default off at the moment.
Yeah.
And I can see a strong case, not trying many cases over 10 million, unlike you, for maybe dropping that. But what I do is I do case manage a fair amount of cases in the sort of 500,000 to 1 million bracket. And it does seem to me that the higher the value of the potential claim, particularly in personal injury, the more the lawyers just go wild and say, here's a massive budget. And I think it is a useful tool, and certainly I find it a useful tool in the 500 to 1 million area. Above 1 million, or say 2 million, which of course was the other area we looked at when we put in the 10 million, is I think much more debatable.
I mean, personally, I've always thought it's very useful in a David and Goliath type situation where you have an imbalance between the parties, so that you have one party who can spend what they like and the other party who is clearly very restricted. And actually, that's a situation where you might want either default on, or if you're having default off, a party can apply to bring cost budgeting into effect. And there may be other similar sorts of cases where you have vulnerable individuals or whatever.
Well, I think that there's a slightly economic argument here, which is you have to remember that certainly in the personal injury field, we are paying for the bill because it's insurance companies, it's our insurance premium, it's the NHSLA. It's not just the small individual taking on the big giant. There are wider commercial interests, and so my own feeling is this: that no lawyer should charge disproportionate costs, full stop, end of story. And the nature of the person involved should not actually mean you derogate from that rule. I can certainly see proportionality begins to become a bit flaky over, say, 2 million and 3 million.
Can I just check, Laura? Do we now have?
We are indeed online now. We have a few people who have logged in, and apparently they can see and hear us.
Excellent. Well, you're very welcome, online people. I'm sorry we started without you. We had some technical difficulties and we haven't got a huge amount of time. So, but we're just on the topic of cost budgeting, and we were thinking about default on and default off. I mean, just on the default, if one did expand, let's say, the default off regime, coming down the value maybe or something. I mean, I've always thought that if you were ever going to do that, not for the above 10 million cases that we have, but in the lower, hardly lower value, but the 5 million, I don't know, it's not low value, is it? But anywhere, myself, I'd be reluctant to get rid of the idea that you shouldn't at least exchange estimates of your costs or something like that. I can't imagine that would ever be, I mean, that to me is one of the hugely important aspects of cost budgeting, whatever you do, is that you have a system in which both parties to the litigation have to tell the other party relatively early on what they think that's going to cost them, because that allows the other party to see what's going on. And at least armed with that information, you can imagine that some people would say, well, now I know what you think you're going to pay or to charge, and therefore I've got a sense of what I'm in for. If I lose, I may want to go to court and say this needs to be budgeted, or I may take the view that it's not so crazy that I need to bother. I don't know.
You would provoke an application if
Yes.
you want or outrageous figures.
Exactly.
That seems very sensible.
But I don't know. What do you think, Chris? You're looking sceptical.
I'm about to don my Vice President of the Association of Cost Lawyers hat and would welcome that proposal, because I'd love the satellite litigation that will fall from that. Because Dominic will serve his budget on me and I'll say, I'll have a bit of that. And then when it comes to trial, he's got double his budget, and I will use that at every twist and turn on the cost assessment that runs beyond that. And I think you might be setting up satellite litigation if we just exchange budgets. And there are so many twists and turns
No, I understand,
on
but
litigation.
I do want to hear from another voice.
Yes,
it's a bit of a tripartite conversation, but can I just go back on that very briefly? One of the criticisms of cost budget is it's effectively already internal satellite litigation. It's already a piece of, you could call it satellite or not, but a piece of thing. And maybe what I'm talking about might well mean that there is some satellite litigation of the kind you're talking about. The question, at least in my mind, is that going to, wouldn't it be lovely, let's say, if that meant that for most cases it didn't happen at all, and only the ones where there was a problem it did happen. I don't know, and that would overall would be a better world. But you're shaking your head, Chris.
I'm really going to put my face mask on in a minute, but to say this: I'm doing stuff from 100,000 up to 1 million.
Right.
It takes me about an hour and a half to deal with the whole thing through start to finish, and a bit of prep time on top as well. That is really not properly classified as satellite litigation. I used to do taxation, bless their
No, Chris, I'm going to exercise my prerogative to stop you. No, not because it's not true, but because we haven't got a huge amount of time, I'm afraid. And I don't know if what I'd like to do is move on to the next topic, just because we've got a lot of things to cover. I can't see any questions in the chat there.
We don't have any in the chat.
Fine.
Also, if anyone is trying to speak and it doesn't seem like we can hear you, please do write in the chat.
Okay. Right.
Move on to guideline.
Let's do that. Why don't we?
Yeah. Okay. So the next topic is guideline hourly rates. Now, guideline hourly rates were always intended to be a broad approximation of actual rates in the market. But the real problem with guideline hourly rates is how you work out what they should be at any particular time. And obviously, the Foskett Committee had enormous problems with that because it did it on the basis of an expense of time approach, which Lord Dyson couldn't accept because there was insufficient evidence. And, do you then do it by reference to the latest approach, the 2021 approach, which is to look at summary assessments, the rates that are being used in summary assessments? How does one arrive at a fair figure, and what should one do to keep it up to date? I mean, does anyone have any views about that?
Or stunned silence.
Can I just make just to answer the last of those points, how to keep it up to date? Really, perhaps the answer is, in order to avoid these inordinately difficult exercises, to find an index that everybody can agree upon as the right way to measure inflation, and then to create a system which allows that index to be applied to those costs on an automatic basis every X number of years. And that would be predictable, efficient, and I think that's all welcome.
Acting as devil's advocate, one of the problems with that approach has always been seen to be that it's potentially arbitrary. You are applying an inflationary measure, but it's an arbitrary approach. You're not looking at what's really being charged out there in the market.
Well, that perhaps is true, although I'd be surprised if that inflationary measure wasn't measured by what actually happens in the market. And also, I think the problem, for example, with the Stewart Committee, the latest approach, was it was perfectly plain, as is obvious, that there is a huge discrepancy up and down the country in what is being charged. So I entirely accept that there is an element of arbitrariness, but I think that's probably an inbuilt problem.
Can I just ask a question? The thing that's always puzzled me, in a sense, about guideline hourly rates is that they're a laudable attempt to describe the world. That's in theory what they're meant to be, because it all goes back to the indemnity principle and the idea that you're trying to identify what the actual costs can, or at least should be. But as you've just explained, so I should have mentioned Nigel Bird is another critical person, genuinely critical person in the cost working group, and we'll see a bit more of Nigel in a minute. But the trouble is, the world is complicated. The world is complicated, and the reality of the attempt to produce guideline hourly rates is to slightly lose track of the word guideline, because if they are guideline hourly rates, and I think they are, then doesn't that maybe make it a bit easier to say, well, they're guidelines which the system, whether it's the Master of the Rolls embodying the system, or the Civil Justice Council, or something, the CPRC or MOJ, or I don't know, but somebody is saying we are going to use our best skill, judgment and knowledge to say these are the guidelines, we're going to take into account evidence of what's happening in the real world, but we're not trying to just produce some kind of statistical average of whatever's going on, because we can't do that. Apart from anything else, the data, and this is the point, the data is just not up to it. And the reason for labouring that slightly is, if that is what they really are, then to some extent you solve the data problem, because courts every day have to deal with insufficient data to make decisions about what's fair, reasonable and proportionate. And we just do it. We do our best, but we recognise that we're setting a guideline rather than having a description. If you see what I mean. I don't know. I mean, that to me, I mean, it's a bit radical, because it means that one is saying, actually, we're not saying that costs for these cases are all in fact £300 an hour or something. We're saying this is what we think a proper guideline should be for costs of cases of that sort. It would be easier to do. Any thoughts? A lot of frowning.
The Court of Appeal twice this year has affirmed the rates and held people to the rates, which is a very interesting approach. Yes.
Yeah.
But yes, the problem with that, though, is if we're going to take Colin's approach, we're going to have city firms on over £1,000 an hour saying, well, that is the market rate for this, but you'll keep holding us to 300 or whatever. And how do we address that problem?
Well, maybe the answer is to say, we're not saying city firms can't charge £1,000 an hour. They clearly can, and they've got clients who presumably can afford it.
Yeah.
What we are saying, though, is that in the context of a civil justice system, the recoverable rate for this work, because it's the recoverable rate, not the rate you charge the client, is something different from that, and accept it. Now, of course, I do understand that what I am saying in a polite way is blows a hole in what we call the indemnity principle, which everyone regards as very important. But does it really? I don't know. I'm not sure. Okay.
Could I just add a quick gloss on what Nigel said? I think you'd have to not just go through an inflation year on year on year. You'd have to have fundamental reviews. I'm very conscious that the marketplace
every now and again
is changing, and the whole idea actually of local areas where people are working from home, where they're working remotely, where they can be badged for a particular area, mean that at some stage we're going to have to look at whether the regions are the right regions, whether we should be doing it regionally. I don't think we've got there yet, but I think it's on the horizon. Well,
actually, we already had some quite strong responses that said that the region should be treated the same as London. For various reasons. Amanda.
The thing I've always found odd is whenever I've spoken to consulars, they've had quite a good sense, quite a codified sense of levels of uplift to the guideline hourly rates, quite a fixed matrix that they operate within for negotiations.
Yeah.
But it seems sort of under the radar. And I always thought if that was more out there and there was a matrix, then that would give greater flexibility to judges, but also greater certainty for users of the system.
Uplift matrix, I've written it down. Yes, let's thank you. Let's move, let's see, third one, this is the sort of this future question, but also more specifically, this business of whether we, maybe as a whole, or maybe for specific areas like personal injury, move the start date of the court case, as it were, to the start of one of these portals. As I say, a thought, and any other thoughts anyone wants to raise, but any thoughts, views, instant reactions? I don't know, Nigel, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, thank you. So in summary, the position is this: when we're thinking about pre-action costs, the problem with pre-action costs is exactly that they are pre-action. Those problems fall under one of two heads. First of all, there's what we might call the Belsman problem. In other words, there isn't the proper regulation of solicitor and client costs because of the difference between contentious and non-contentious costs and their link with whether or not there are proceedings. The other problem is that at the moment there is no way under the CPR to determine questions of cost liability pre-issue. So in other words, we can't determine the who pays cost question, we can only determine the how much question. One way to deal with both of those points without the need immediately to change the Solicitors Act, and without the need somehow to change the rules and deal with Section 51, is just to push the start point back. So that if in certain pre-action protocols, perhaps the housing pre-action protocol, litigation commenced, proceedings started, however we look at it, at the moment the pre-action protocol was engaged in, then the rules would apply, so we get rid of the rules problem, and the business would be contentious because it would be related to county court proceedings. It's in principle that's the approach.
Yeah. As I say, it's a thought. Any thought? I mean, my own view about it, bluntly, is it's. I keep saying it's a thought because it's a thought. I don't know whether I think it's the right thing to do, but I can see the advantages of the idea. Superficially, and I don't mean that in an offensive way, but at first sight, it looks like something that might have interest. It has all the hallmarks to me of a thing with unintended consequences. It just looks like one of those things that you think, oh, what a great idea, and then you do it, and then you discover that you completely, I was going to use a rude word, completely messed up something else that you hadn't thought of. But that, you know, life isn't always like that. Yes, please.
I'm sure it's fraught with unintended consequences, and if that's the case, is there an argument or a practical case for trying it in certain specific areas rather than jump straight on dominating doing it in certain areas? I think if it were possible to pilot it, that might give you an indication as to how viable
that's a thought, actually,
in that sector.
Yeah.
And indeed in rural civil sphere.
Yes. I mean, it might be what.
No idea as to where you start by way of a pilot, but
No.
Make a suggestion.
No, interesting. I mean, funnily enough, one of the if I can share my pain, if I may, just on piloting in civil justice. One of the problems with piloting, we really do try, because we've learned over the years that actually it's so much better to pilot stuff if you can. But then it's a bit like the 1960s. What if they had a war and nobody came? What if you have a pilot and nobody comes? And sometimes that's what happens. And it's very frustrating, because there's then a sense that people then complain because they say, well, you piloted and you're just going to do it. And I understand that, and actually it's not true. It really, really isn't true. And I won't bore you, but I can give you examples of things that we piloted which we didn't do. But there are also things we piloted which we really wanted to understand what would happen. And eventually we just had to do it because we couldn't get anyone to do it if it wasn't compulsory. Which is, and I'm not saying that's, I mean, you just touched one of my trigger points. No, but not on that thing. But Joe, what's your feeling on this issue?
Well, I rather agree with you, the unintended consequences, but I do like the idea of a pilot if we could get people to take it up.
Yes.
And it may be that in one area, one or two areas where it's obvious that it might have serious benefits, even if there may also be some downsides, that would work.
Yeah. Abbas, you look like you're about to give us the answer.
I'm not sorry. I speak as a person who doesn't have much to do with costs, but one of the unintended consequences would be that if a claim settled before the claim, if a first claim settled before proceedings, how would costs then be paid? There's no provision to limit that the resolution of the claim would give rise to cost consequences. But
yes.
It would be the position if a claim settled and there was no agreement on the question of costs, or if the claimant simply decided they wasn't going to proceed based upon the disclosure.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, I think Nigel can speak for himself as well, but my understanding is I think that's exactly the thinking behind this, is to at least make it possible in circumstances where the parties settle but can't agree what to do, who's liable for the costs. Because, as you know, if they settle and they agree who's paying, then the court can resolve the amount. But if they can't agree who's paying, and if that's I think part of it is this. And it's something I've certainly felt as a judge for a long time. It's always felt like a bit of a tragedy when the parties can agree everything except who pays the costs. It would be so nice to be able to find a way of capturing that that agreement and sort of embracing it,
Yes.
and then being able to bring the whole thing to a dispute instead of the totally correct legal analysis. I'm not doubting the legal analysis, which is that they haven't agreed that, then they haven't agreed, and it's true, but it's also it's always felt, you know, like a pity.
I think there is a big line of authority that says that in those circumstances you can, in fact, bring an application.
Well, I think you can. I think to be accurate, I think you can if they agree. You can. They have to at least agree that much.
If there's no agreement, you can still bring a claim.
Yeah, so you can still bring a claim, of course.
This agreement, of course, there's still a procedure rules apply.
Yeah, exactly. Nigel, do you want to? Sorry, thanks, Fabus. Thank you.
I think a point to add is that if the right reaction protocols were carefully chosen, the right plans put in place, then this is actually a recognition of what is already happening in terms of JET 2 reminding us that PACs are an integral part of the architecture of civil litigation, and the court having an overall control of what goes on. And also, of course, it's what happens in the low value PAC cases, because we've tied in the RTA and the employer liability and public liability portals to fast track costs.
Yeah.
So in a sense, it's simply doing through the front door. It's simply putting a sign at the entrance to explain what we're already doing in some circumstances. And on unintended consequences, very briefly, Andrew Higgins, who is responsible, as you know, for leading the group on reaction protocols, makes the point in the report that there are always, unfortunately, unintended consequences.
Yes.
They kind of perform, but obviously we have to manage those. That's unless there's anything in particular. I won't hog
Okay.
any more time.
We've got
Just to
chance.
say, we've got 5 minutes left.
Thank you, Laura. Perfect. And yes, Amanda, please.
On the nobody coming to the pilot party point, I'm just thinking drug trials. There's not going to be an incentive. There's nobody who wants to gamble their health. Maybe, a speedier or more accessible system whilst in the pilot to get people to the front door might be an idea.
Interesting idea.
Yeah. Well, Robert, you.
No, I was just going to say about pilots that I think there is an issue about if they're entirely voluntary as to whether people do them. But another way of doing it is just taking perhaps quite a small area.
Yes, slice.
Say it is compulsory.
Yes.
At least for a time.
Yes.
The best area and learn from it.
Yeah.
And that has been done.
And that has been done. No, it has been done. You're right. That's true. That's very true.
Yeah.
Can I just
Yes, please,
something?
Abbas. Yes, please.
This is a personal thing.
Yes, good. No,
I'm just wondering whether it's maybe completely outside your remit, and if it is, then I apologise, but I'm just wondering whether in the case of public interest proceedings, such as judicial review, whether the costs rule should be abolished altogether. In other words, in order to allow access to the courts, if there is, for example, an application for judicial review, unless it was taken completely unreasonably, then it should not attract a lot of costs against the claimant.
Well, in Aarhus claims. I've been to Aarhus, by the way. It's a nice place. And I was
actually talking more about disqualification claims.
Well, but they are an example where there is a form of cost capping. At least it's not the same thing. Thank you. I'll hand at the back, and then I'm afraid you're going to get the last word. So please use it.
I'm going to start by saying, so I'm Jo Osborne from the Ministry of Justice. I'm a complete intruder in this space. I know nothing about costs, but I'm very grateful to have heard the discussion. I lead on legal support policy, so I suppose I'm a bit better versed in the roles vision that you talked about before about this kind of end-to-end process. My question, or what's going through my mind, and forgive me if it's a red herring, is would there potentially be a sort of unintended consequence of by starting the case at court earlier, would people then kind of linearly progress towards court rather than considering other forms of dispute resolution, like mediation or ombudsman or arbitration? So I just wonder if that would be something you want to kind of ensure against, so that people don't narrow their options too soon.
No, that's a very good point.
Yeah.
I see.
Which I am also responsible for in my policy.
And with that thought, think of the court fees, I'm afraid we do have to draw it to a close. Well, thank you very, very much, everyone. That actually was really useful and interesting. And
Thank you very much indeed.